when a meteor estimated at 60 meters in diameter exploded 2 miles above the Siberian forest, with an explosive force estimated at 12 megatons. That's about 1,000 times the power of the Hiroshima atom bomb. The Tunguska explosion felled all the trees for 40 kilometers in every direction. Tel El Hammam is a mere 15 kilometers east of Jericho. Hence, the air blast shown to have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, or Tel El Hammam, would equally have devastated Jericho at the same time. The city was devastated from above. It was completely abandoned for 700 years. Welcome. Today we're going to delve into something that's actually contained in another book in my series that we haven't actually looked at before in these episodes. This is the third book chronologically in the series. It's looking closely at what happened in what was called the Promised Land, or nowadays we might call it the Levant, between 4,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago. I was surprised when I looked at this as to just how much historical evidence has now come to light from various sources that give us a very good indication of what actually happened in this area in this period. Today we'll focus on a topic preserved for us in ancient scripture, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and its destruction by the wrath of God. The biblical narrative in Genesis tells of God warning Abraham that his anger with the people in the sinful city was overflowing, and therefore he would destroy the place. Both the Israelite name for the place and the events told in Genesis suggest this city was, let's say, metrosexual. Its positioning and fame suggest it was a major trading centre. A thriving metropolis tends to develop more liberal attitudes, particularly from the standpoint of itinerant shepherds. Abraham's interest was linked to his brother Lot, who ended up living in what's referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah with his family. The description in Genesis points to Sodom being down in the valley. Obviously, this would be the valley of the River Jordan. The text refers to separate kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the destruction wrought by the Lord was to cities, plural, of the plain. The text describes total destruction. As we have seen, ancient oral traditions passed down over millennia usually contain some factual basis. This event is much more recent than the two I referred to in a previous episode, which have been reported last year in The Economist. One which was an event that happened in the western side of Victoria State in Australia, which happened 35,000 years ago. And the other was an eruption of Mount Mazuma in Oregon, 5,700 BC. What we're now talking about is something 3,500 years ago, like yesterday. In biblical chronology, Abraham and Lot split when they were journeying south through Canaan before Abraham got to Egypt. My research points to Senusret I, whose dates are normally looked at as around 1971 BC to 1925 BC, being the pharaoh that Abraham stayed with. So the destruction of Sodom may have been around 1950 BC, according to the biblical record. If these events were written up by Abraham's team, then it would have been in Sumerian cuneiform. That's where Abraham was born, that's where he was educated. He was the crown prince, so he would have been fluent and no problem writing these things up. Or maybe it was written up a few centuries later in Egypt, so might be in hieroglyphs perhaps. But the surviving text is in Hebrew and couldn't have been written if this is a story, an oral tradition, it couldn't have been written down before around 1000 BC, which was when Israelites adopted the new Phoenician alphabet, which was not invented until 1050 BC. However, new archaeological evidence points to a strong probability of what for biblical purposes will be a far-reaching inaccuracy. New evidence appears to merge together the two events that traditionally are regarded as being 4 or 5 centuries apart. Whilst the information I present is new, I think the detail and the accuracy is quite convincing. Recent analysis of soil and rock samples from Jericho and the extensive ruins of a large city in the suspected location of Sodom and Gomorrah has yielded additional information confirming their destruction as being attributable to a meteor. We have long had clear archaeological evidence that Jericho suffered devastating destruction. The earliest permanent settlement at Jericho, an area now known as Tel Es Sultan, has been dated to 9600 BC, the end of the Younger Dryas period. That city location may have been initially chosen because of the number of fresh water springs in the area. It grew to its importance due to being located on the key connecting road between the two most important ancient highways, the Way of Horus, later known as the Via Maris, and the King's Highway. Now, on the map here, it's a little difficult to follow, I agree, but it's better in the book. The two red lines coming out of Egypt, you have the Via Maris, which is the Roman name for what was originally by the Egyptians called the Way of Horus, that comes up the coast and then joins the King's Highway, which comes slightly more south and then goes up the eastern side of the Jordan Valley. Both converge in Damascus and then continue through Palmyra up to the river Euphrates. So this was the main communication and transit route for trade between the empires of Sumer and Egypt. In trying to date when these roads were first used and developed, the only information available is odd references which hint that it may have been dating back to around 9000 BC, which incidentally is when Damascus, areas near Haran, were occupied, and clearly I suggest there may have been a city-based culture in Egypt at that time. So these were paramount importance, these two roads. Linking the two, going directly through Jericho and across what only for the last 100 years or so has been called the Allenby Bridge across the Jericho. This is a very old link between the two. Just on the south side of the Allenby Bridge is this site, which I think may be the ruins of what is called in Sodom Gomorrah. Efforts to date the destruction of Jericho by various archaeologists during the 20th century have provided a range of dates. The earliest is 1617 BC, other dates are 1573 and 1530. So actually they're all within 80 years, an event which was 3,500 years ago. Everyone agrees, though, that the destruction of Jericho was not limited to just the city walls falling down. The entire place was destroyed. And the city was completely abandoned for 700 years. And that is interesting because it's despite the fact that it's located on a key trade route. So the caravans would have been constantly passing along this road, and yet no one decided to re-establish a settlement in Jericho, despite its initial attractions. Since 2006, excavations at a site known as Tel El Haman, 10 kilometers east of the River Jordan and 10 kilometers north of the now northern edge of the Dead Sea, have uncovered a vast urban site 5 times the area of Jericho ancient Jericho. Many multi-story buildings have been identified, but the whole area was flattened by a devastating explosion. Unlike the impact of earthquakes or warfare, the excavations indicate a very different cause for the destruction. Pottery shards have outer surfaces melted into glass. Mud bricks and building plaster appears to have boiled, bubbled and melted, whilst human and animal bones were shattered into tiny fragments. Other evidence, including shocked quartz, iron and silica-rich microsphericals, and nanodiamonds, indicate the temperature of between 2,500 centigrade and 2,800 centigrade. You only get that from a meteor impact or a meteor airburst. Professor James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, compares the destruction seen at Tel El Hammam with the Tunguska event of 1908, when a meteor estimated at 60 meters in diameter exploded 2 miles above the Siberian forest, with an explosive force estimated at 12 megatons. That's about 1,000 times the power of the Hiroshima atom bomb. The Tunguska explosion felled all the trees for 40 kilometers in every direction. Tel El Hammam is a mere 15 kilometers east of Jericho. Hence, the air blast shown to have destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, or Tel El Hammam, would equally have devastated Jericho at the same time. The city was devastated from above, and over the subsequent 3,500 years, a hilltop was formed over the rubble, which is now being excavated. This points to a meteor lacking a solid core that broke up as the forces of gravity exerted themselves upon it as it was falling through the atmosphere, leading to an explosive airburst and the absence of an impact crater at ground level. Tel El Hammam, at 5 times the size of the then contemporary Jericho, was clearly a major city, and many conclude it must have been the city which became infamous in the biblical story of Sodom. Even Google Maps now gives it a secondary name of Sodom. Given its size, it must have existed for some centuries prior to its destruction. So far, excavations have uncovered evidence of occupation back to 4,700 BC. So it existed for at least 3,000 years before this airburst. Considering its location beside the King's Highway, right here, right next to this massive important road, it must have traded with Egypt and Sumer in the centuries before the Hyksos occupation of Egypt, Lower Egypt. So there must be numerous references to the city, but with a name that we've never been able to place. The new excavations arrived at a date of 1650 BC, plus or minus 20 years, so we're very certain of that date because of all the radioactive materials being collected and analysed. That's the date for the destruction of Tel El Hammam, which is close to earlier estimates for the destruction of Jericho, so that fits. Being so close geographically, both would have been destroyed at the same time from the same cause. Such an explosion, a few miles up in the atmosphere, would have been both heard and seen throughout the ancient Middle East. It would clearly have been the loudest noise anybody alive at that time would hear in their lifetimes. Canaanites, living anywhere between 50 and 200 kilometers, you see that's 100 kilometers, so a 200 kilometer circle could well have been knocked over by the pressure wave from the explosion. So you hear a deafening sound and then you're thrown to the ground. Boy, you're frightened about God's wrath. So what do? You flee. Where to flee to? Egypt. What is amazing is that the best date for what the Egyptians called the Hyksos taking over Lower Egypt is 1655. 1655 BC. And the central case, the dating of the destruction, is 1650. Could these two events be that well connected? Amazingly. Conventionally, the invasion of the Hyksos taking over Lower Egypt is explained as a slow migration of hunter-gatherer farmers who maybe were fleeing from a period of too many sparse rainfall periods. But there isn't really much to support that, whereas this evidence suggests to people fleeing en masse. The Egyptians would clearly have heard of this as well and seen it, and waves of people fleeing with whatever they could grab, quite a lot of people, and it happened at a time when the Egyptians were in the middle of a dynastic feud. In fact, Meteor, who we referred to a couple of episodes back, is the one who developed the structure of dynasties by which we number Egyptian pharaohs, the 30 dynasties. He allocated the 15th dynasty to the people with very alien names to the Egyptians, taking over and running Lower Egypt as the sort of northern half of Egypt. So it all sort of fits together. What is also clear is that there are many new towns developed with housing laid out in a non-traditional Egyptian way, closer to Canaanite houses from this period. So it again supports the idea of mass migration into Egypt by the Canaanite inhabitants of what now do refer to as sort of Israel and Palestine. The fact that both Jericho and the town that we think may have been Sodom and Gomorrah were subsequently abandoned for so many centuries is somewhat puzzling. As we will examine in future episodes, Egypt controlled the entire Levant for most of this millennia. Tel el-Hammam was close to the ancient King's Highway, and Jericho is also on the main link of the King's Highway to the Way of Horus. These two roads formed the key trunk routes for trade and military operations across the Egyptian possessions in Asia. Such was the importance that the Egyptians developed and maintained military garrisons at intervals all the way along both roads. So after Pharaoh Ahmose expelled the Hyksos from Lower Egypt in about 1550, so it's about 100 to 110 years after this event when the Hyksos took over Lower Egypt, the Egyptians managed to unify the country and expel the Hyksos around 1550. Egyptian rule was progressively re-established over what is now Israel and the areas north and east of modern Israel. Why were these important trade centres just abandoned, seemingly in perpetuity, at least for Sodom? The reason appears to lie in the high concentration of salts found in samples immediately above the ruins. Tel el-Hammam and Jericho lie only about 10 miles north of the north coast of the Dead Sea. So an airburst explosion would have sucked up vast amounts of very heavily saline water, and a lot of it would have descended over that area. All the freshwater wells would have been polluted for centuries. The soil, apart from being baked solid with the heat of the explosion, would also have been covered in a deadly layer of salt, making it completely infertile. So I think that explains why it took such a long time, even for Jericho to recover. Now we know the date, it should be relatively easy for historians to identify the original name of Tel el-Hammam, as its destruction must have been a major event. Unfortunately, the surviving records of the ruling Egyptian pharaoh, Meteor, are sparse, as Egypt was suffering from dynastic feuds and the influx of the Hyksos probably fleeing from the catastrophic event. Babylonian records should be more promising. Given the relative proximity and its stable rule, under the Amorite dynasty of the First Babylonian Empire. It's estimated that Amidatana, the grandson of Hammurabi, who ruled from 1683 to 1647 BC, during which this event is supposed to have happened, he was followed by two further descendants until Babylon was attacked and largely destroyed by the Hittites under Mercilus in 1595. Amongst the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets lying in the vaults of the museums of Philadelphia, Berlin, and London must lie a description of the destruction of Jericho and Tel El-Hammon, which will reveal its original name. Also, hidden in plain sight, perhaps, the term Sodom and Gomorrah, whilst it's supposed to have separate kings, is following an ancient Jewish practice of ascribing adjectives as proper names of many things. It is likely that it was actually only one city, but the use of the term destruction of the cities, plural, of the plain, may be referring to Jericho and Sodom. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and it's brought something entirely new to you. Further details may be found in part 2 of my series, The Promised Land, 2000 BC to 1000 BC. Thank you very much. Until next time.